When we talk about the holiness of God, it would be improper to not at the same time deal with the responsibilities and implications of that for man. And theologically, where this always comes up is in terms of the question of the meaning of the phrase image of God. It's an interesting thing to me that man is called the image of God only a very, very few times in all of Scripture. It's a statement and a description that is found quite rarely. Yet in the history of theology and in the history of Christian anthropology, the notion of man's being created in the image of God has been deemed to be super important and of a special kind of significance. And you might think that this is somewhat disproportionate in terms of the attention that we pay to this notion of being created in the image of God in terms of the few times in which the Scripture mentions it. But even though the notion of man's being created in the image of God occurs relatively few times quantitatively, the places where they occur are of great significance. And I think theology has been quite correct in assigning a very important place to this notion of man as being created in the image of God. Basically, where we discover the description of man as being created in the image of God is, first of all, in the creation narratives, where man is distinguished from the rest of the created order. And he is distinguished by this description, that he is created in the image of God. No one else or nothing else is said to be created in the image of God. And so at the very beginning, at the foundation of biblical revelation, we find man set apart and distinguished from everything else in creation by virtue of this description, that he is in the image of God. Now, the big question is, what does it mean to be created in the image of God? Let's take a look briefly at those texts in the Old Testament and see if we can make some kind of sense out of them. First of all, in verse 26 of the first chapter of Genesis, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' And God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, 'Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over every living thing that moves on the earth.'" All right. First of all, we read in this text that God says, "Let us create man in our own image and in our likeness." So in trying to understand what the Scriptures mean by what we call the imago Dei, the image of God concept, there have been different approaches historically to interpreting this passage. And I'd just like to give a brief survey of those so that we can see the background against which I'll be developing the theme this morning. First of all, there have been those who have tried to see a twofold character to this image concept, because the Old Testament says that God says, "Let us create man in our image and in our likeness." And the two words are different, image and likeness. So some people have come to the conclusion that the image represents one aspect of man and the likeness represents something else. That there's a certain sense in which we are in the image, but there's also a sense in which we are like God. Now, probably the reason why theologians historically have tried to differentiate between image and likeness is they have, at the same time as trying to understand what it means to be in the image of God in creation, are trying to wrestle with another difficult question in biblical theology, and that is the question, how do we understand man after the fall? If he's created in the image and likeness of God before the fall, then the question comes up, is he still in the image of God and in the likeness of God after the fall. See? What is man prior to the fall? What is man after the fall? And that raises all kinds of questions because it's obvious that there is a radical change in the nature of man from the time of creation and the time of the fall. And so the question that is perennially raised among theologians is this question: is man still in the image of God? Or was he, in his sinfulness, removed from the role of being the image bearer of God? And it seems like there's a certain sense in which man is not in the image of God anymore, but there's still a certain sense in which he is. And so theologians are trying to sort that out and divide it out and figure out what sense he is still in the image of God, what sense he isn't. Can we go to a human being today and expect to look at him and learn something about God as we would from an image or a likeness? Well, these are the kinds of questions we'll be looking at in the course of our study here. Let me just begin by saying, first of all, that I think biblically, any attempt to distinguish between image and likeness is bound to end in some kind of artificial concept. Because in terms of the literary structure of the Scriptures, the term image and likeness are used interchangeably. And I think that one conclusion we can come to safely is that whatever this image concept is, there is no decisive difference between the use of the term image or the use of the term likeness. That they're used together and interchangeably. That to be created in the likeness of God is the same thing as to be created in the image of God, and vice versa. But again, that doesn't really help us in defining what exactly it is that we are in the image of God. Now again, there have been several attempts to define and distinguish the essence of the image concept. And there have been several attempts, and I'm not going to go into them all, but I'd like to go into two that have been very important in the history of the church in attempts to analyze and interpret the meaning of the image of God. One, which is perhaps the most widely discussed and classical and traditional understanding of the image of God, is defined in terms of what is called the analogia entis. The analogia entis. I know that's a technical term, but it's one that you should know, because if you do any reading in theology, you're bound to see this term again and again, and it'll be left untranslated. Analogia, A-N-A-L-O-G-I-A. It's the first word, and then entis, E-N-T-I-S, simply means an analogy of being. An analogy of being. That there's some kind of likeness or relational similarity between God and man. That there's a likeness in the being of God and in the being of man. And classically, this has been defined in terms of the fact that man is a thinking being and God is a thinking being. That is, man has intelligence and God has intelligence. And there's the point of similarity. Obviously, God is more intelligent than man, but the sense in which man is uniquely intelligent shows his reflection and likeness unto God. That man has a will and God has a will. And then again, that man has an emotive life where he has the capacity to love, etc. And God has an emotive life and he has the capacity to love. And so historically, we have tried to understand this notion of image in terms of a similarity of being between God and man, in terms of will, mind, emotion, etc. Now, I personally am of the opinion that that does not really get at the biblical understanding of what it means to be created in the image of God. I think it touches on it and is helpful to a point, but I don't think it really grabs a hold of the concept of what it means to the Hebrew to be created in the image of God. And I'm a little bit frightened that if we reduce the notion of the image of God to the fact that we have intelligence and that we have a will, and that we have emotions, that we're going to lose something in the long run about our understanding of who we are. Thomas Aquinas, for example, described man and differentiated man as a rational soul, and it's his rationality, his ability to think abstractly, his ability to reason, which distinguishes him from all the rest of the created order. Now, here's why I have problems with this. First question is, what does it mean to be intelligent? What kind of an ability of thinking must a creature have before it's considered to be intelligent? So often we very loosely use terms like instinct when we describe activities of animals such as dogs and birds and things like that. We say, well, we can train a dog to respond to a certain kind of stimuli, or we can get him to respond to commands and he can do certain things, but we certainly wouldn't call that thought. Then we ask the question, is that dog conscious or is he unconscious? If he's conscious, what is he conscious of? If he's unconscious, how can he respond at all to these things? I think to say that a dog doesn't think, or that an elephant doesn't think, or that a bird or an animal doesn't think, is a very, very tenuous statement to make. Obviously, the ability of these animals in terms of their own consciousness and sophistication doesn't seem to be as advanced as ours. But to say that they don't think or that they're not intelligent seems to be somewhat arbitrary. And then there's the question of degrees of intelligence. If you take Rin Tin Tin, see, who's a very, very able dog and can respond and do things and respond to commands and work out problems and everything else to a very sophisticated degree as far as dogs go, and compare him to a 6-month-old human child. Which one is more intelligent? You could put through a certain amount of tests on these things and come to the conclusion that the dog was more intelligent than the child. If we measure human beings strictly on the level of intelligence, we're going to get into trouble. The same thing is with respect to the question of willing. If you've ever gone through obedience training with a dog, you understand the forcefulness of the desire of the dog, and that you have to deal with the desire of the dog, and that that dog has a will is clear. Unless we mean by a will, again, a very complicated, complex understanding of interrelationship between intelligent thought and desire. But the dog is conscious and he has desire. We know that dogs can manifest affection and emotion. They cry, they become angry, they become hurt, and they even experience shame. We can measure that to some degree. So what I'm getting at is that these kinds of distinctions between man and animals are not quite sufficient to grasp the significance of what it means to be created in the image of God. Now, another way in which the image of God has been interpreted is that the uniqueness of man is found in what is called, at least by one theologian, the analogia relationis, rather than an analogia entis, rather than an analogy of being, that is the point of contact between God and man. Man is seen as being in an analogical relationship to God in the sense that God exists in a unique kind of relationship, inner dynamic within the Trinity, and man also has a unique ability to be in relationship with other people, in community. In the text we read, and God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created. That is, he created them for a dynamic relationship that is to be somewhat like the inner workings of the Trinity itself. The only problem I have with that is that he creates the animal kingdom, male and female too. And he creates the rest of the creatures in some kind of a relationship. And I don't think that the fact that we have a capacity to relate to creatures or to relate to each other or to relate to God exhausts the meaning of the image of God. And one last interpretation is that simply we look like God, the Mormon view, that we have a body and God has a body. That Adam looked exactly like his creator. That's the position that the Mormons take, that God is a physical being, corporeal being, 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, and all that, and that we just simply are little gods in terms of our structural makeup. Well, I don't even think I need to comment on that. Very crass view of what this means, and I don't think it's really worthy of much comment at this point, but let's go on. But there is a point that I think that the Mormons have made an important contribution with their view of the physical character of God. And that is, if you take seriously Hebrew literature, you know that we can't go to it and try to isolate some part of man that is in the image of God, like his mind, or his soul, or his will, or his emotions. So I read this text, I see this, that the totality of man, all that man is created in the image of God, and that includes his body. Now, doesn't that mean then when we're driven to the conclusion that God has a body? No, it doesn't. And here's why. Because the concept of image, though it includes the body of man, does not necessarily mean that God has a body. And I'll try to explain it a little more fully in a minute as we zero in on what it means to be created in the image of God. I think the best way to discover the meaning of image of God is not by simply looking at these texts in the Old Testament, but by turning to the New Testament, where we see Jesus described as being the brightness of God's glory, the express image of his person, and elsewhere we're told that he comes to us and is the fullness of the image of God. So if we want to find out what authentic humanity is, what man is in creation, what man is intended to be, what it means to be in the image of God, we look at Christ. Now, we see that Jesus has 2 arms and 2 legs, and that I have 2 arms and 2 legs. Yet somehow the image of God is greatly fogged and besmirched and decayed in me, but it's not in Jesus. What is the difference between Jesus and me? How do we see in him more clearly God than we see in me? Well, let me back up a minute and take a look at these words like image and likeness. To the Jew, an image is something that mirrors or reflects the original. The image is something that mirrors and reflects the original. What we see is that if we understand the nature of God, the call of God to mankind in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, and the meaning of the words image and likeness, the only conclusion I can come to is that to be created in the image of God means that man uniquely has the capacity to mirror and reflect who God is. And specifically, he has the capacity to mirror and reflect the holiness of God. Because we see that the inner essence of God's nature is found in his holiness, as we've examined last week. And if man is placed in a position where he is in his image, then it seems to me that what they're getting at is that man is called to live in a relationship, that's part of it, using his mind. He has the ability to think, the ability to will, and the emotions. All that is involved. And his body is involved in that too, because in man's whole life, in his intellectual life, his emotional life, his volitional life, and his physical life, man is called to mirror and reflect who God is. Now, how is that supposed to be carried out? How can man reflect and mirror the holiness of God? And how do we know that it's the holiness of God that is the ground basis for this image concept? Well, there's an address I gave a few years ago that I'd like to call your attention to that I entitled Creation or Chaos. I don't have time to go through that whole address today, but the central point of it I would like to put before you. And that is that we have a tendency in our day and age to be greatly influenced by the tradition of humanism. And the humanist tradition sees man as the ultimate significance in the universe. The humanist is manifestly non-Christian. If you've ever read the Humanist Manifesto, for example, you would see that the Humanist Manifesto goes to great lengths to decry the importance of religion. Here's the revised Humanist Manifesto. That is the Humanist Manifesto II that was recently published, bringing up to date the cause of humanism since the first Humanist Manifesto was written in 1933. I'd just like to read a couple of statements here from this Humanist Manifesto #2 to give you an idea of where they are in terms of their relationship with Christianity. We believe, however, that traditional dogmatic or authoritarian religions that place revelation, God, ritual, or creed above human needs and experience do a disservice to the human species. Any account of nature should pass the tests of scientific evidence. In our judgment, the dogmas and myths of traditional religions do not do so. Even at this late date in human history, certain elementary facts based upon the critical use of scientific reason have to be restated. We find insufficient evidence for belief in the existence of the supernatural. It is either meaningless or irrelevant to the question of the survival and fulfillment of the human race. As non-theists, we begin with humans, not God, nature, not deity. Nature may indeed be broader and deeper than we now know, and new discoveries, however, will but enlarge our knowledge of the natural. We reject those features of traditional religious morality that deny humans a full appreciation of their own potentialities and responsibilities. We can discover no divine purpose or providence for the human species. While there is much that we do not know, humans are responsible for what we are or what we will become. No deity will save us. We must save ourselves. Again, ethics is autonomous and situational, needing no theological or ideological sanction. And on and on and on it goes. The humanist cause then begins and ends with man. There is no recourse, no appeal to anything that transcends man, no creation by a divine being, but a certain emergence out of the slime of history comes man, and his destiny, of course, is up to him. Now, the origin of humanism is usually placed in ancient Greece with the work of the philosopher Protagoras, who made famous the slogan Homo Mensura, which means simply man the measure. The point is, man is the measure of all things. Now, the reason I'm taking this little minute to go back into the humanist background is this. You live in a culture that has been thoroughly saturated with humanist thought. I would say the overwhelming ideology of American culture is one variety or another of humanism. Now, I'm laboring the point because it seems to me that sometimes the Christian gets messed up in trying to understand who man is because of that influence of humanism upon him. We go back to the creation narrative, and we see that the creation narrative establishes the existence of the universe in stages, beginning with the first day, and then moving to the second day, and then to the third day, and on to the fourth day, to the fifth day, and we see kind of a rising crescendo of significance to the things that are being created. Almost like we go along the so-called biological scale of the less complex to the more complex. See? And then finally, after God creates the heavens and the earth and the sea and the sky and the birds and the plants and the fish in the sea and the birds in the air and the beasts of the field and all that sort of thing, then what happens? He creates man. And we see that creation reaches its culmination point, it reaches its zenith in the creation of man. And so we walk away from that text thinking that the goal of creation, the purpose of creation is man, because he's created last. That seems to be the terminus point, does it not? That seems to be the place where everything comes together in the creation of man. So therefore, we think that the reason for creation is the glorification of man. And at that point, we're nothing more than humanists with a creator in the background somehow. The only way we differ from the humanists is in assigning our ultimate cause to the creating activity of God. But as soon as we think that the goal of creation is man, we've lapsed into the serious error of humanism. Well, I'd like to remind you that the creation account does take place on a structured basis, and there is a progressive movement. There is a motion from the less to the greater. But the culmination point is not the sixth day. There are 7 days in creation, not just 6. And to be sure, man is created on the 6th day, but the 6th day is not the final day. God does not finish his creation on the 6th day and sanctify or make holy the 6th day. The day that he sanctifies, the day that he hallows in creation, is the 7th day, the Sabbath day. The 7th day is a holy day. Now, without going into all the complexities, the significance of that, the one thing that we can see that is clear, and that is that the end of creation is hallowed. The 7th day is hallowed. And to the Jew, that means something. That means that the goal of creation is holiness that brings the Sabbath rest. And this theme is reiterated throughout the Old Covenant and into the New Covenant, that we are promised a Sabbath, that we are promised a rest with God. But the condition for that rest is what? Holiness. So it's on that basis that I come to the conclusion that what man is called to be in creation, in the image of God, is to be one who mirrors and reflects the holiness of God. That's his task. That's his significance. That's his meaning. And God makes that very explicit when he enters into covenant with his people, saying, "You shall be holy, for I am holy." All right, now then the big question is, 2 questions. What does it mean to be holy? See? And second of all, how can I bear witness? How can I mirror and reflect the holiness of God? Again, I think we have to be driven back to the creation account. What does God say? Let us make man in our own image, according to our likeness. See? And let them rule over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the sky, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. And then God creates man in his own image. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over everything that moves on the earth." Then he goes on to say that man is called to dress, to till, to keep, to replenish the earth. Now, I see the basic significance in this aspect of what it means to be in the image of God in official terms. That it's the office that man holds that makes him unique. To be sure, he's given unique capabilities. He's given a higher degree of intelligence, a higher degree of volitional insight and all that, which is all important. But the significance of man in creation is in the office that he holds and the task that he performs. God makes him his vassal king over the earth. We are the image bearers insofar as we are the representatives of God to the rest of the creation. See? We are the ambassadors of God that wear his signet ring, as it were. We represent him to the birds and to the fish and to the grass and to the whole creation. God creates us and places us in a position of authority, saying, let him have dominion over the earth. Let him rule the earth. Let him be king over the earth. And how we exercise that dominion and how we exercise that reign over the earth determines whether or not we are in fact mirroring and reflecting the holiness of God. That means that how we rule the earth, how we dress, till, and keep the earth, how we relate to each other, how we relate to the animals, how we relate to all those things, see, determines whether or not we are reflecting God's holiness or reflecting our own sinfulness. To rule over the earth does not give man the license to exploit the earth, to pollute the earth, to rape the earth, to injure and destroy each other. But it gives him the awesome responsibility to be God's vice-regent, king in his place. Man is told to name the animals. Why? Because in biblical categories, the one who names the other one is the one who has authority over the other one. Who names Adam? God. Who names Eve? Adam. Who names the animals? Adam. All right. Who names Adam and Eve's children? Adam and Eve. See? Who names John the Baptist? God, because he takes specific authority, takes authority away from Zechariah and Elizabeth. See? So he reserves the prerogative and the right to name that child. See, that naming process, when Jacob wrestles with the angel, he fights all night. What's he fighting for? The angel's wallet? What does he want from the angel? Yeah, but how does he think he can get the blessing? Tell me your name. See? If I can get control of your name, then I'm victorious. See this throughout the Scriptures. Adam and Eve are placed in a position of kingly, royal authority. But not, get this, not as autonomous rulers. But their kingship is to be subordinate to the kingship of God. And they are to exercise the reign of God. And that means that all that they do must reflect the character of God. And the world is looking at man so that in him they can see the Creator. But that fails to take place. Man does not dress, till, and keep the earth. In other words, how do we reflect the glory and the holiness of God? I've labored the point already that God's holiness is not to be understood simply in terms of ethics, simply in terms of piety, simply in terms of righteousness. But the notions of righteousness are intrinsically related to it. Because whatever God is, he is not unrighteous. And when we are unrighteous, we are not reflecting the character of God. And so the basic way in which this business of working out the image of God in the human sphere comes to us in Scripture is at an ethical level. That the way in which a person mirrors and reflects the holiness of God is by obedience to that God. The reason why we see in Jesus Christ the perfect image of God is because Jesus Christ was perfectly obedient. He fulfills the commandments that God gives him. The whole question of the loss of the image of God comes to pass only after man is disobedient. And so even though the world still might see God somehow in humanity, whatever we can display about the nature of God immediately becomes distorted as soon as we disobey him. Because in disobeying God, we are not working out and manifesting his character. Now, here's the irony, that in disobedience, not only does man lose his capacity to reflect and mirror the holiness of God, not only does he become a usurper rather than a godly king, not only does he, you see, insult and tarnish the character of the one who has appointed him in this position by misrepresenting God, not only does he do all of those things, but man insults the dignity of God and loses his own dignity. Because remember that our dignity, our dignitas, our glory, our holiness is not intrinsic. Let me just make a parenthetical statement about this. The humanist exalts the virtue of man and cries out for the significance of human dignity. And he wants to preserve the dignity of man. And he sees the dignity of man threatened by the authority of God. Because man loses his dignity in religion, according to the humanist, because he has to submit himself to some higher authority, and that humiliates me. You see how that works out? And so the humanist believes that it's undignified to believe in God and to submit to God and try to reflect the holiness of God. And so for humanists, the only way man can have dignity is to repudiate God. So his message is dignity comes through disobedience. Now there's two things I want to say about that. First of all, if the humanist denies the existence of God and the subordination of man to God, what possible basis does he have for talking about the dignity of man? As I understand the concept of dignity, get this, please. The dignity of something, the significance of something, is inseparably related, not identified with, but inseparably related to the question of origin and the question of destiny. Now, apart from God, what is the origin of man? If man is not created from God, what are the alternatives to that? That he emerges accidentally. It's a cosmic accident from the slime. He's a cosmic mistake. No reason for his origin. No transcendent purpose behind his being. He's a cosmic accident. It's what Ed Carnell said, that man is nothing more than a grown-up germ sitting on the cog of the wheel of a vast cosmic machine that is destined to blow itself to smithereens. Man begins from nothingness, and his destiny is what? Nothingness. He comes from the dust, he goes to the dust. He comes from the slime, he ends up as slime. And in the meantime, the humanist is singing the praises of his significance and of his dignity. How much dignity is there in a germ? Let the germ be sophisticated. Let it have a brief flash of beauty on this earth. But if its origin is nothing and its destiny is nothing, how can there ultimately be any significance to humanity? And so in seeking to preserve the dignity of man, the humanist destroys any possibility for ultimate dignity in man. Do you see that? Now, biblically, dignity is related to obedience. From the humanist standpoint, man must be disobedient in order to retain his dignity. Now, I said earlier in the lecture that usually the origin of humanism is pinpointed in the pre-Socratic age with the writings of Protagoras and his motto, Homo Mensura. I would like to suggest that the origin of humanism antedates Protagoras, that it comes into play long before Protagoras ever picked up a pen, and that the motto of humanism classically is not Homo Mensura. That's at best neo-humanism. The original thesis of humanism was not the Latin term Homo Mensura. It was, you shall be like God. Humanism was not invented by a human being. It was invented by a snake who came to Adam and Eve and said, did God say that? Do you mean to tell me he's placed you in this kingdom? He's given you dominion over all the earth. He's given you the unspeakable privilege of mirroring and reflecting his person, his character, his essence, his dignity, his holiness to all of the creation. And what have you done? He's put restraints upon you. He's taken away your freedom. There's no dignity in that. God is putting these restraints on you because he knows that if you eat of this tree, you will be as gods. Not just vice kings, but the whole king. Not just a vassal king, you see, but the sovereign king. And God doesn't want you to mirror and reflect his holiness. He wants you to have a taste of it, but he doesn't want to share it with you. He wants to keep you underneath. And the only way you can have dignity is by disobedience. And the rest is history. Until we see the restoration of the dignity of man in the person of Jesus Christ, who once again shows us what it means to be human, what it means to reflect and to mirror ultimate dignity, holiness, in obedience.